Have you ever wondered how someone can be chosen by God, walk with Him, and still fall so far? This is not just a theoretical question. It's a question that resonates with anyone who has ever felt the weight of divine calling, the pressure of responsibility, or the tension between righteousness and the world's demands. It is the raw reality of living in a broken world, where even those closest to God are not immune to temptation, failure, and the overwhelming pull of human weakness. We've all been there. Moments when everything seems to be slipping through our fingers, when the weight of life's expectations grows too heavy, and we can't seem to find the strength to keep going. It's in those moments when the pressure is mounting that we often make decisions we regret, choices that, in hindsight, seem so out of character, so unlike who we know we are meant to be. We've all experienced those defining moments of vulnerability, where our faith is tested, and we choose the path of least resistance over the path of righteousness. Those moments when we feel like God is silent, and we are left to fend for ourselves, facing a crowd whose demands grow louder and louder. But it wasn't always this way for Aaron. A man chosen by God. A man who witnessed firsthand the miraculous acts of God. Aaron, the brother of Moses, a figure held in high esteem by his people, was appointed by God to stand between the sacred and the human. He was called to lead, to intercede, to mediate for the people of Israel in their most desperate moments. He wore the sacred garments, carried the responsibility of the high priesthood, and stood in the Holy of Holies to offer sacrifices on behalf of the nation. He was set apart, anointed, and called for a divine purpose, a calling many could only dream of. But even with all that, even with the glory of God surrounding him, Aaron made a choice that would forever mark his legacy. This is the story of Aaron, the high priest who failed at the most critical moment in Israel's history. A man who should have stood as a pillar of righteousness, yet, when tested, chose the path of compromise, leading the people into one of the most disastrous moments of spiritual rebellion the Bible has ever recorded, the building of the golden calf. It's not just an old story. It's a cautionary tale, a mirror reflecting the struggles that many of us face today. It's a story about leadership, about the pressure to please others, and about the internal battle between faithfulness to God and the desire for immediate peace, even if that peace comes at the cost of obedience. Aaron's fall is a powerful reminder that no matter how close we are to God, no matter how much divine calling we carry, we are still human. And being human means being vulnerable to temptation, to pressure, and to the choices we make when we are alone in the face of adversity. Imagine this. You've spent years standing beside a leader, watching God work through them, witnessing miracles, and receiving divine instruction. You know your role. You're not the leader, but you support, you speak, you translate, you help. You've watched your brother, Moses, perform great wonders, confront Pharaoh, and lead the people with unwavering faith. You've seen it all. And now you're tasked with leading in his absence. The weight is on your shoulders. The people are demanding. Fear is spreading. And God seems silent. How does someone like Aaron, a man who stood in the divine presence of God, who witnessed the miracles of the Exodus, who was anointed as high priest, how does he fall so far? How does he, just like so many of us, succumb to the pressure when the stakes are highest? What happens when the one called to lead falls short, when the high priest becomes the one who leads a nation into idolatry? The golden calf wasn't just an accident, it was a decision, a series of choices Aaron made under pressure, in the absence of his brother Moses, when he was left to lead the people alone. The pressure was immense. The demands were overwhelming. And the silence of God during that time created a void that Aaron filled with the wrong choice. Aaron had been in the shadow of Moses for so long, always the one standing beside the leader, the one supporting, never the one to carry the weight alone. But now he was the one the people looked to. Now he was the one tasked with making decisions. And when those decisions came, they came with tremendous weight. The people were restless, impatient, afraid, and desperate. They wanted something tangible, something they could see. They couldn't understand the delay of Moses on the mountain, and their fear of abandonment grew. The silence was deafening. This is where we begin to see the cracks. Aaron, in his human weakness, faced with the chaos of the people and the silence from God, gave in. He gave them what they wanted. He didn't challenge them. He didn't point them back to the faithfulness of God. He didn't trust in the divine plan. He yielded, and in that moment the spiritual disaster began to unfold. The golden calf was born, and with it, the spiritual rebellion that would lead Israel to worship an idol while the glory of God was still on the mountain. But the question still remains, how did this happen? How did Aaron, a man chosen by God, a man who had witnessed the divine miracles and heard the voice of God, fall so deeply? And what does this teach us about leadership, about the pressure to conform, and about the consequences of compromising our beliefs in the face of fear and impatience. In this story, we'll uncover not just the fall of Aaron, but the deeper lessons about leadership, temptation, and the choices we make when the pressure is on. This is not just about Aaron's failure, it's about the decisions we all face in our own lives, when the world is pressing in on us, when God seems silent, and when the temptation to take the easy way out seems so strong. How will we respond? Will we stand firm in obedience to God, or will we yield to the pressures of the crowd? Aaron's story is a reflection of all of us. It's a story of divine calling, human failure, and the mercy of God that restores even the most broken leaders. It's a story that will challenge us to think about our own golden calf moments, those times when we compromise our values, our integrity, and our obedience to God just to find peace in the moment. And it's a story that calls us to ask ourselves the tough question. In those moments, will we choose the right path, or will we fall as Aaron did? Stay with me as we dive deeper into Aaron's journey, uncovering the lessons that speak to us today, and ultimately finding hope in the mercy and restoration that God offers to those who truly repent. Aaron was not an ordinary man. Chosen by God to represent the people, to mediate between the sacred and the human, he was anointed as Israel's first high priest, the most privileged position in Israel. This wasn't just a title, it was a divine calling that set him apart from everyone else. It was the ultimate honor, and yet, it came with an immense responsibility that few could bear. The weight of this calling was far beyond anything Aaron might have imagined when it was first bestowed upon him. To be chosen by God, to wear the sacred garments, and to enter into the very presence of God on behalf of an entire nation, this was Aaron's reality. And this reality was no easy task. Imagine the weight of that calling, dressed in the sacred garments, standing in the Holy of Holies, interceding for a sinful people. Picture the high priest, adorned with the elaborate robes that symbolized the holiness he was meant to embody. The breastplate with 12 precious stones, each representing one of the tribes of Israel, shined brightly, but Aaron knew that this was more than just a piece of attire. It was a visual representation of his duty. His every action in that sacred space carried eternal consequences. Every prayer he uttered, every sacrifice he offered, was done not just on his behalf, but on behalf of a nation, God's chosen people. The holiness of God hung heavy in the air, and Aaron, as the mediator, stood between the divine and the human, the sacred and the sinful. But while the calling was extraordinary, it was not without its challenges. There was an inherent tension between the privilege of being chosen and the responsibility that came with it. Aaron knew that one mistake could cost not just his life, but the hope of an entire nation. He didn't take the role lightly. Every time he stood before the altar, every time he entered the Holy of Holies, he carried the weight of God's holiness and the people's sins on his shoulders. The tension between his privilege and responsibility was palpable. He wasn't just a leader, he was the very symbol of Israel's relationship with God. His actions, his obedience, and even his personal holiness were critical to the spiritual well-being of the people. This wasn't a job where failure could be brushed off. There was no room for error. For Aaron, the consequences of his actions reached far beyond his own life. If he failed, the people of Israel would bear the consequences, and Israel's covenant with God could be jeopardized. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and yet Aaron, despite his chosen position, was not immune to the very human flaws and weaknesses we all struggle with. The holiness of God demanded nothing less than absolute obedience, and Aaron understood that this calling required him to be more than just a servant. It required him to be faithful, vigilant, and without fault. However, as we will see, this tension between privilege and responsibility would soon become the very thing that tested his faith, his leadership, and his obedience. The life of Aaron is a vivid reminder of the complex nature of spiritual leadership. When God calls us to lead, to serve, to bear the weight of His glory, it's not just a blessing, it's a calling that demands our whole selves. And in the midst of this sacred calling, the pressure can be overwhelming. There's a sense of accountability that never leaves, a realization that every decision, every moment of leadership, has eternal ramifications. This, perhaps more than anything, is what makes Aaron's fall so impactful. He was chosen by God, set apart for this holy task, but when the moment came to step up, to lead with unwavering faithfulness, the weight of the world seemed to crumble around him. And it was in that very moment of pressure, when the stakes were highest, that Aaron's true test would unfold. Aaron wasn't just a bystander in Israel's journey. He stood side by side with Moses, supporting him through the most pivotal moments of Israel's history. When Moses confronted Pharaoh with the power of God, Aaron was right there, speaking the words that Moses could not. When God sent the plagues upon Egypt, Aaron was with Moses, proclaiming each devastating judgment with divine authority. Through the parting of the Red Sea, it was Aaron who stood with Moses, leading the people to freedom, witnessing the miracle that saved Israel. As they ventured into the wilderness, Aaron was there, supporting Moses, both physically and spiritually, as they guided a confused, frightened, and often rebellious people toward the Promised Land. Together they formed an inseparable duo, with Moses at the forefront, receiving divine direction, and Aaron at his side, speaking to the people, translating God's will into words they could understand. But their partnership was far from ordinary. It was a dynamic leadership formed out of necessity and divine purpose. Moses had divine vision, a unique calling to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt and into the land of promise. But Moses struggled with speech. He was reluctant, hesitant, and unsure of his ability to communicate God's will to the people. In contrast, Aaron had eloquence. He could speak with clarity and conviction, and he was respected by the people for his words. Yet, despite his natural ability to speak, Aaron lacked the prophetic guidance that Moses had. He was not the one who received the direct revelations from God, and in many ways Aaron's role was to support Moses in this divine calling. Together, Moses and Aaron were complementary. Moses had the vision, but Aaron had the ability to communicate that vision to a nation. One provided the spiritual direction, the other provided the voice that carried it to the people. They were two halves of a whole, a partnership forged in both divine will and necessity. But as we all know, leadership isn't always as clear-cut as it seems. How many of us know the difference between supporting someone else's vision and being the one who carries it all? It's one thing to stand beside a leader, to help execute a vision, to be part of a team moving in one direction. But when the weight of leadership falls solely on your shoulders, when you are the one who must make the decisions and carry the burden, everything changes. Aaron had spent so much time supporting Moses, standing at his side, being the spokesperson and helper. But in a moment, everything would shift. Aaron would be faced with a situation where he couldn't simply support Moses. He had to step up, to make decisions on his own, to lead in a moment of crisis. And in that moment, Aaron's true character would be revealed. This is a place where many of us find ourselves, isn't it? We can be part of something larger, supporting others, serving in the background, doing our part in a bigger plan. But when the moment comes for us to step up and lead, we're faced with the overwhelming weight of responsibility. Aaron's partnership with Moses had been one of support, but now, when Moses was absent, Aaron would have to stand on his own. The pressure of that shift, the sudden responsibility, would soon test him in ways he never anticipated. The dynamics of leadership, of stepping out of the shadows and into the light, are not easy. And for Aaron, this moment of transition would prove to be one of the most challenging times of his life. How would he handle the pressure when the stakes were higher than ever? Could he rise to the occasion, or would the fear, the doubt, and the pressure break him? The answer to that question would forever change the course of his story and the story of Israel. When Moses went to Mount Sinai to receive God's law, Aaron was left behind. In the mountains, Moses sought divine guidance, conversing with God, receiving the stone tablets inscribed with commandments that would shape the future of Israel. But below, in the valley, Aaron found himself facing a different kind of challenge, one that he was not prepared for. He was alone, left to lead a frightened, disillusioned, and spiritually fragile people. The people had followed Moses out of Egypt, but now, with Moses gone for a period of 40 days and nights, they began to question the future. Was Moses even coming back? Was this God who had delivered them really still with them? Their hearts, once full of the excitement of liberation, were now filled with uncertainty, and they began to panic. As the leader of the people, Aaron was left to hold everything together. He had been Moses' right hand, his spokesperson, his partner. Together they had confronted Pharaoh, crossed the Red Sea, and performed miraculous signs. But now, standing in the heat of the desert, with the weight of Israel's future on his shoulders, Aaron was confronted with a very different reality. Could he rise to the occasion? Could he lead without the constant support of Moses' prophetic guidance? He had spent his entire journey in the shadow of Moses, a supporting figure, never fully having to stand on his own. But now he was thrust into a position of leadership that was no longer theoretical or part of a partnership. It was real. The Israelites, hungry, weary, and frustrated, began to demand answers. And in that moment of uncertainty, when leadership was needed most, Aaron would be forced to make decisions that would forever alter the course of his life and the lives of an entire nation. In those critical days we see a shift in leadership, a transition from a supportive role to a sole leadership position. This moment would reveal whether Aaron truly had the fortitude to lead. Moses had always been there, steady and strong, offering divine wisdom and guidance. Now Aaron had no one to lean on but himself. His leadership would no longer be under the protection of Moses' presence. It would be his alone to carry. But what would he do? The people were restless. They had seen miracles, but they hadn't seen Moses for over a month. Fear had begun to fester in their hearts, and in the absence of leadership, they were desperate for something to hold on to, something tangible to replace the intangible God they could not see. They wanted security, stability, something they could touch, something they could worship. And that desperation quickly turned into disobedience. Aaron, caught between divine calling and the pressure of the people, found himself facing an internal conflict. He had been Moses' right-hand man for years, never questioned, always in support. But now he was alone, holding the weight of the entire nation in his hands. Would he be able to rise to this challenge, or would he succumb to the pressure? Leadership, as Aaron would soon find out, was not just about making decisions when things were easy. It was about holding fast when the storm hit, when the winds of doubt and fear began to tear at the very fabric of the people's trust. Aaron had seen Moses handle that pressure with divine wisdom, but now it was his turn to face it. The question was, would he make the same choices Moses would have made, or would he let the pressure of the moment break him? The wilderness trial exposed something Aaron had hidden beneath his robes: his own vulnerability. The desert, harsh and unforgiving, did not simply test the faith of the people. It tested Aaron, revealing weaknesses that had previously gone unnoticed. Up until this point, Aaron had been a man of great privilege and responsibility, but that privilege had not yet been tested by true adversity. Now, standing in the desert with nothing but the voices of the impatient crowd around him, his weaknesses began to show. There was a crack in his leadership, a flaw in his resolve that had never been apparent before. He was not the perfect leader. He was not immune to doubt, fear, or temptation. The pressure, which had once been shared, now rested solely on his shoulders. And the weight of that pressure began to reveal the fragility of his faith. Aaron had been Moses' second, his spokesperson, the one who stood at Moses' side when challenges arose. But when Moses was gone, when the divine vision was out of reach, Aaron was left to manage the emotions, fears, and doubts of an entire people. The weight of spiritual leadership became apparent as the very first test came. The people, afraid and confused, turned on Aaron. They demanded that he make them a god they could see and worship. In their panic, they forgot the very God who had led them out of Egypt, the God who had split the Red Sea and brought them to freedom. They wanted something tangible. And Aaron, faced with a moment of choice, faltered. He gave in to the demands of the people, choosing to appease them rather than to lead them toward obedience. The consequences of Aaron's decision were immediate and severe. The people, led by Aaron, built the golden calf, a symbol of idolatry that would forever haunt Aaron's legacy. The sin of idolatry once again became a plague on Israel, and Aaron, the very one who was supposed to guard the people's hearts and minds, led them into sin. The pressures of leadership, the desire to please the people, and the overwhelming sense of fear and uncertainty caused Aaron to lose his way. The wilderness trial had exposed his weaknesses: his fear, his lack of faith in God's ability to provide, and his inability to stand firm when the pressure became too much. As we reflect on Aaron's story, we must ask ourselves how we would have responded in that same position. When the pressures of leadership mount, when the weight of responsibility becomes unbearable, what do we do? Do we succumb to the demands of others, or do we stand firm, trusting that God will lead us through the wilderness? Aaron's failure in this moment serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of leadership when driven by fear and the need for approval. Leadership is not about pleasing the crowd, it's about remaining faithful to God's calling, even when the path ahead is uncertain and the crowd is demanding something that is not aligned with God's will. Aaron's failure in the wilderness was not a one-time lapse. It was a culmination of moments when he chose the easy path over the righteous one. The desert, in its harshness, revealed the truth of his character. He was vulnerable, he was human, and he was not immune to temptation. This wilderness trial, this test of leadership, exposed Aaron for who he truly was: anointed, chosen, but still deeply flawed. And that is where his story becomes relatable. It's not just a story of a man who failed in the wilderness, it's a story of all of us. We all face our wilderness trials. We all have moments when the pressure becomes too great. The question is not whether we will fail, but how we will respond when we do. Will we give in to the demands of the crowd, or will we hold fast to the truth that God has called us to lead? The mountain loomed tall and silent, its peak hidden in clouds, as Moses remained on top for 40 days. During this time, the people of Israel had found themselves alone in the wilderness without the leader they had followed so faithfully. The air was thick with anxiety, and with every passing day, their patience wore thinner. They had journeyed so far, witnessed so many miracles, and yet now, the silence from Moses and from God felt deafening. The people began to murmur. At first it was quiet, a few scattered voices of doubt. But as the days stretched on, those voices grew louder. The once hopeful Israelites who had trusted in God's promises, now found themselves facing the harsh realities of their circumstances. The food supply was running low, the water supply uncertain. And above all, their leader Moses was nowhere to be found. What was meant to be a temporary absence now felt like abandonment. It was then that they turned to Aaron, their second in command. The pressure to act was overwhelming. The people were desperate. They needed something tangible, something they could see, something they could worship. They cried out to Aaron, demanding a God who would go before them. The God who had parted the Red Sea and sent manna from heaven now seemed distant, out of reach. And so, in their desperation, the Israelites demanded that Aaron make us gods who will go before us. Aaron was at a crossroads. He stood between a fearful, impatient people and a God who had revealed himself in miraculous ways. His calling as the high priest weighed heavily on him. He was supposed to be a leader, an intercessor, the one who stood before God for the people. Yet here, in this moment of extreme pressure, he was faced with an agonizing choice. Should he stand firm in his faith and point the people back to the God who had brought them out of Egypt? Or should he yield to their demands for a God they could see? In this moment, Aaron's leadership was tested as never before. He was not only under external pressure, but also facing the internal conflict of wanting to maintain peace and avoid rebellion. How many of us have been in situations where we've had to choose between doing what we know is right and what is easier in the moment? The people were restless, the pressure to give them what they wanted was immense. And Aaron, in his moment of fear, made the decision to compromise. This is where the story becomes painfully relatable. How many times in our own lives have we found ourselves pressured to make decisions that conflict with our values and beliefs? How many times have we been in situations where the easier choice seemed to be giving in, just to avoid conflict or to please others, even when we knew deep down that it wasn't the right thing to do? We've all been there, haven't we? Faced with the temptation to appease, to smooth things over, to do what's popular instead of what's faithful. Aaron's decision wasn't one of a simple momentary lapse in judgment. It was a conscious, active yielding to the crowd's demand. Instead of standing firm in his role as a spiritual leader, he allowed himself to be swayed by the people's emotions. He didn't just give in, he led the charge. He actively participated in the creation of the golden calf, the very idol that would defile the holiness of Israel. The golden calf was not something that appeared suddenly or accidentally. Aaron didn't just nod along to the crowd's suggestion. He took the gold, the very gold that had been a symbol of God's miraculous provision in the Exodus, and turned it into an idol. The gold, which had been given to the Israelites as a token of God's power and deliverance, was now twisted into a false representation of God. In his mind, perhaps Aaron thought he was only giving the people what they wanted, temporarily placating them until Moses returned. But in doing so, he had compromised the very foundation of their faith. The people who had witnessed God's miraculous deliverance now turned their backs on him in the most blatant way. And Aaron, the high priest, was the one who led them into it. The people didn't just ask for a God, they demanded that Aaron provide them with one. And in his moment of weakness, Aaron gave in. He didn't just agree to their request, he played an active role in crafting the idol, melting down the gold, shaping it with tools, and declaring a festival to the false god. It was not just a small mistake, it was a profound violation of God's law, one that Aaron more than anyone should have known better than to make. The irony in this moment is almost unbearable. The gold, which should have served as a reminder of God's faithfulness, was now being used to create an object of idolatry. And the man chosen by God to be the high priest, the one tasked with leading the people in holiness, was the very one leading them into sin. His decision to yield to the crowd's pressure marked the beginning of a spiritual disaster. The golden calf wasn't just a physical idol, it was a spiritual betrayal. By yielding to the people's demands, Aaron violated the very covenant God had made with Israel. He allowed the people to abandon the one true God, to break the first commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me." The golden calf represented the collapse of their faith. It was an outward sign of an inward failure to trust in God's plan, a turning away from the God who had rescued them, to worship something they could control, something they could see. This is where we need to stop and reflect. How often do we, like Aaron, give in to the pressure to please others, to compromise what we know is right, just to avoid conflict or to gain acceptance? The golden calf that Aaron created is a symbol of the idols we build in our own lives when we choose temporary peace over long-term faithfulness. It may not be a physical idol made of gold, but how often do we place other things, relationships, success, comfort, above our obedience to God? How often do we choose the approval of others over the approval of God? Aaron's actions serve as a warning to us. The cost of compromising our faith, of yielding to the demands of others, is much greater than we realize. Just like Aaron, we may think that a small concession won't hurt. But as we see in this story, compromise leads to greater sin, greater consequences, and a deeper separation from God. Aaron didn't just fail in a moment of weakness. He led an entire nation into spiritual rebellion. And the effects of that rebellion were felt by everyone. The crisis moment Aaron faced wasn't just about one man's failure, it was a moment that defined the fate of a whole people. The people of Israel turned from God, and their actions set in motion a series of events that would lead to divine judgment. But there was still hope for Aaron and for Israel, as we will see in the next part of the story. The consequences of their sin were severe, but God's mercy was still present. However, the mercy didn't come without discipline, and the consequences would be lasting. The lesson here is clear. When we give in to pressure, when we compromise our faith for the sake of popularity or acceptance, the consequences are far-reaching. And just like Aaron, we must face the reality that our decisions, both big and small, can have a profound impact on those around us. The moment Aaron gave in, the floodgates opened. The scene that followed was nothing short of chaos. The Israelites, once so solemn and determined, were now caught up in a frenzy of idolatry and sin. The music swelled, the dancing began, and before long, the people were lost in their revelry, worshipping the golden calf that Aaron had helped create. They celebrated as though nothing had happened, as though they had not just broken their covenant with the very God who had rescued them. The sacred order that had been established with such care and divine purpose seemed to fall apart in an instant. It wasn't just a moment of worship, it was the destruction of the very foundation of their faith. The sacred rituals, the sacred laws that had been passed down to them, were now ignored, trampled underfoot by the choices of their leader. The people's hearts, once full of reverence for God, were now distracted and led astray by their own desires. Their trust in God, who had shown them countless miracles, had turned to dust. Their celebration was no longer a sign of gratitude, it was an open rebellion against the holiness that had set them apart. And Aaron, as their high priest, was at the center of it all. This wasn't just the sin of the people, it was Aaron's sin too. He was the one who had given them the gold, the one who had crafted the idol, the one who had sanctioned the very act of idolatry. His decision to yield to their demands, to bow to the pressure and lead them in this rebellion, was the catalyst for this destruction. But the consequences didn't stop there. As the people danced around the golden calf, completely unaware of the gravity of their sin, God's judgment descended. The heavens opened, and what had once been a moment of divine presence became a moment of divine wrath. Moses, having received God's command, descended from the mountain. He saw the debauchery, the chaos, the complete disregard for God's law, and his anger burned hot within him. He shattered the tablets of the covenant, the very covenant that had been written by the finger of God himself. It wasn't just an act of anger, it was a symbolic act of Israel's breaking of that covenant. The broken tablets were a visual representation of the shattered relationship between God and his people. The people had broken the covenant even before they had fully understood its meaning, and now they were left to deal with the consequences. Moses didn't stop there. He took the golden calf, burned it, ground it into powder, and made the people drink the bitter waters of their own idolatry. This was no symbolic gesture, it was a public, humiliating act of judgment. What had once been a symbol of their deliverance was now reduced to ashes and forced into their mouths. The people were made to taste the consequences of their sin, quite literally. The God who had once parted the Red Sea now showed them that their disobedience would not go unpunished. And yet, despite the severity of the judgment, it was not over. The consequences of Aaron's disobedience would extend far beyond that moment. God had a reckoning to make with those who had sinned. The Bible tells us that about 3,000 men lost their lives that day. These weren't just random casualties, they were the direct result of Israel's idolatry. When sin is allowed to run rampant, it does not remain contained. It spreads, infects, and ultimately destroys. The people's sin didn't just affect them, it affected the entire camp of Israel. Now, Aaron stood in the midst of the fallout, knowing full well that his actions had set everything in motion. He had failed, and the consequences were tragic and irreversible. He may have survived physically, but spiritually, the weight of his sin hung over him. His leadership had failed the people of Israel, and his failure had cost them dearly. It's easy to think that our mistakes won't affect others, that our small decisions won't cause harm. But Aaron's story serves as a brutal reminder of how one bad decision can ripple out, causing widespread devastation. We often think that our actions are private, that the choices we make in the quiet of our own hearts will remain hidden. But the truth is, our decisions affect more than just ourselves. They impact those around us, and in some cases they can change the course of entire communities or nations. This is the sobering truth of sin. It is never isolated. It spreads. It corrupts. It destroys. And Aaron, despite his divine calling, despite his anointing, was not immune to the consequences of disobedience. He allowed himself to be swayed by the voices of the people, by the pressure of the crowd, and it led him to make a decision that would have lasting repercussions. The people of Israel, whom God had set apart, were now faced with the consequences of their rebellion, and the price was steep. The lesson here is clear. No matter how small the concession may seem in the moment, no matter how much we try to justify our actions, the consequences of disobedience can be far-reaching. And it's not just about us, it's about everyone around us. Just like Aaron, when we fail to uphold God's standards, we allow the ripple effect of sin to spread. What begins as a small compromise can lead to devastation, not just in our own lives but in the lives of others. The moment of Aaron's yielding marked a turning point in Israel's journey. But it didn't stop there. There was still more to come, more consequences to be faced and lessons to be learned. But as we see, the consequences of disobedience don't just vanish. They remain, lingering like a shadow, following us even when we try to move forward. And for Aaron, the aftermath of his failure would be a constant reminder of the high price of yielding to pressure and neglecting God's commands. In the next part of this story, we will see how Aaron responded to this judgment and what God's mercy looked like in the midst of such devastation. For now, however, let this truth sink in. The consequences of disobedience are real. They are severe. And they affect more than just the one who makes the choice. When we choose to disregard God's commands, we not only harm ourselves but also those around us. The ripple effects of sin are powerful, and the cost can be more than we are prepared to pay. Moses, though angered and hurt by Aaron's actions, interceded on behalf of his brother. The fact that Aaron's life was spared shows the power of intercession and God's incredible mercy. Moses stood in the gap, pleading with God to spare the people and his brother. This moment was profound. Not only did it reveal Moses' deep relationship with God but also his willingness to sacrifice for the people he loved, even when they didn't deserve it. God, in his mercy, agreed not to destroy Aaron, but the consequence remained. The very act of Aaron's failure would forever alter his ministry. He would continue to serve as high priest, but now there would be an indelible scar on his position. Every time Aaron entered the Holy of Holies, every time he offered sacrifices for the people, he would remember the golden calf and the price of his disobedience. His leadership would no longer be about perfection, it would be about redemption. It would be a constant reminder that God's mercy is available, but it doesn't come without its consequences. This highlights a powerful, relatable principle. Just like Aaron, we may not always face immediate consequences for our actions. The consequences may not always come in the form of immediate judgment or destruction. But they leave marks on us. Lasting impressions that shape our relationship with God and the way we interact with others. Sin, though forgiven, often comes with scars that remind us of where we've been. Aaron's life post-failure is a stark reminder of that. Aaron's second chance didn't mean that everything went back to normal. It meant that he had to live with the reality of his past decisions, but still, God gave him a chance to fulfill his calling. Even in the aftermath of the golden calf, Aaron was still chosen to lead the people in offering sacrifices, still allowed to intercede for Israel. His grace came through repentance and God's mercy, but the scars from that moment would stay with him forever. But it didn't mean Aaron was any less worthy of the position God had given him. He was just now a different kind of leader. A humbled leader, one who knew all too well the cost of disobedience. God's justice was still evident. Aaron's failure couldn't be erased, and neither could the pain and consequences. But God's mercy was also profound. He didn't abandon Aaron. He allowed him to be restored. What this story shows us is that God's mercy is not a free pass to sin. It's an opportunity for transformation. Yes, there will be discipline, and yes, there will be consequences, but there is always room for repentance. Aaron's story is a testimony to the fact that even in our deepest failures, there is room for grace. We are like Aaron in so many ways. We stumble, we fall, and sometimes we lead others astray. But the beauty of God's mercy is that it doesn't end with our mistakes. Even when we fail, even when we are deserving of judgment, God is still there. He still loves us, still calls us to serve, and still offers us the chance to lead others. But we must remember, His mercy is not a free pass. It's an invitation to become more like Him, to learn from our failures, and to continue moving forward in obedience, even if it's with scars. In the same way Moses interceded for Aaron, Jesus intercedes for us. Our sins are covered by His grace, but we are called to repent and live in a way that honors the God who forgives us. This principle isn't just about leadership, it's about life. Each of us has been given an opportunity for redemption, but that redemption comes with responsibility. It comes with a call to live in obedience to God, knowing that He is faithful to forgive but also faithful to discipline. God's mercy never excuses sin, it redeems it. That's a powerful message that we must carry forward in our own lives. And just like Aaron, we can find hope in knowing that God's mercy is greater than our worst mistakes. But we must also remember that His grace doesn't make us immune to the consequences of our actions. It simply offers us a chance to continue fulfilling His purpose, even in the midst of our imperfections. And that's where the beauty of true spiritual leadership lies, in being broken and restored, in knowing our failures, but still choosing to serve and follow God's call, no matter the cost. This is a humbling truth. Our failures don't define us, but how we respond to them does. Aaron's story proves that. Just as he was restored, we too can be restored. It's never too late to make things right with God. Though Aaron had failed spectacularly, he was not discarded. His restoration to the high priesthood did not erase the memory of his failure, but it transformed the way he carried out his sacred duties. Every time he entered the Holy of Holies to make atonement for Israel, he did so with the weight of his own sins and the sins of his people heavy on his heart. The scars of his past were not easily forgotten. But God did not see Aaron's failure as the end of his story. Instead, He chose to use Aaron, broken and restored, as a vessel for His work. Aaron's life after the golden calf incident was a complex one. On one hand, he had been forgiven. He had been restored to his position, and yet, the truth of what he had done was something he carried with him. The golden calf wasn't just a one-time mistake, it had been a pivotal moment that changed everything about the way Aaron viewed his leadership. The priesthood was no longer just about his role or his privilege, it was about carrying the weight of redemption. Every act of intercession, every offering made on behalf of Israel, now had a layer of personal significance. Aaron could no longer approach his work with the same unexamined confidence he once had. His failure had humbled him. When he stood before the altar to make atonement for the people, it wasn't just the sins of Israel he was atoning for, it was his own as well. And that gave him a unique compassion, a deeper understanding of the people he was serving. He could relate to their brokenness, their rebellion, because he had been there. This is a lesson for all of us. God doesn't discard us when we fail. He doesn't turn His back on us. In fact, it is often in our weakest, most broken moments that He does His most transformative work. But here's the catch. Restoration doesn't come without responsibility. The weight of our actions doesn't simply disappear. Yes, we are forgiven, but the consequences of our mistakes can linger. Those scars remind us of our need for God, for His grace, and for His continued work in our lives. Aaron's journey shows us that true restoration isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning from it. It's about growing through the pain and continuing to serve in spite of our failures. It's about acknowledging the scars not as badges of shame, but as symbols of God's mercy and faithfulness. When God restores us, He doesn't just put us back in the same position, He transforms us. He uses our scars to refine us, to make us more effective in the work He has called us to. Much like Aaron, we too are called to serve, whether in leadership, ministry, or simply in our everyday lives. But just as Aaron learned through his failure, we too must learn that our past mistakes don't disqualify us. If anything, they equip us with a unique understanding of grace, humility, and mercy that we can pass on to others. The weight of our actions may remain, but that weight can be used to push us forward, to drive us toward deeper dependence on God and greater compassion for those we serve. So, while Aaron's life after his failure was not without difficulty, it was a life marked by God's grace. And in that grace, Aaron found not only forgiveness but the strength to continue fulfilling his calling, even in the face of his past mistakes. This is the essence of true restoration, the ability to stand once again, to be used by God, and to serve with a heart that knows the weight of both failure and grace. And for each of us, that's the calling God offers, to rise again not in our own strength but in His. To serve, not in perfection but in brokenness, knowing that it is through our brokenness that God's strength is made perfect. Aaron's story isn't just an ancient tale. It's a mirror for us today. We all face pressure, make mistakes, and sometimes choose the easy way over obedience. But it's in these moments, these decisions, where we can either rise to the occasion or stumble. Aaron, a man chosen by God, led an entire nation into idolatry at the most critical moment. Yet he wasn't discarded, he was restored. And in that restoration he bore the weight of his failure for the rest of his life, reminding us that while grace is freely given, consequences remain. True spiritual leadership isn't about pleasing people. It's about staying faithful to God, even when the crowd's demands are deafening. How many times do we compromise just to keep the peace or fit in? Aaron faced the pressure of a rebellious people demanding an idol, and in that moment he chose their approval over God's command. He didn't stand firm in obedience, and it cost Israel dearly. Yet God still gave him another chance. This isn't just Aaron's story, it's a warning for all of us. We all have our golden calf moments, the compromises we make to find peace or avoid conflict. It might not be a literal idol, but we all have something that tempts us to substitute true worship with false security. What are the golden calves in your life? The relationships, ambitions, comforts, or choices that pull you away from God's will? The easy way might seem appealing in the moment, but it's the obedience to God's word that leads to true peace and fulfillment. If you've failed, remember, there's always restoration through God's grace, but we must humble ourselves and repent. Aaron's life teaches us that God doesn't give up on us, even when we fail monumentally. But we have to be willing to acknowledge our mistakes, seek forgiveness, and continue to serve Him with humility. It's not about perfection, it's about surrendering to God's will no matter how hard it may seem. So here's my challenge for you today. Leave a comment below and share with me the most impactful lesson you've learned from Aaron's life. Have you faced your own golden calf moment? How did you respond? How did God restore you after a fall? Your story could help someone else who is struggling right now. If this video spoke to you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that will transform the way you view your spiritual journey. Let's grow in faith together and learn from the lessons of those who walked before us. Your journey, like Aaron's, is not defined by your failures but by how you respond to them. Will you choose to stay faithful even when the road is tough? Will you stand firm in your obedience, even when it feels like the world is pushing you to compromise? God's grace is waiting, and restoration is always possible when we humble ourselves before Him.